Hello everyone and welcome to the first webinar on the field of risk management in English for this season. My name is Britt and I am managing the portfolio of governance, risk and compliance here at PECB. So today's webinar will be on ISO 31000, dealing with project risks, presented by Mr. Gilberto Costa, Senior Project Manager at GBC London. Before Gilberto begins his presentation, I would like to ask the audience to please write down any questions you may have during the webinar in the chat box on your control panel, and we'll respond to a few at the end and answer the remaining through email depending on the time left. On this note, as some of you may already know, we have begun to issue certificates of webinar participation, so please email me at the end of the session at marketing@pecb.com for further details. Enjoy the session. Gilberto, you may begin.
Thank you, Britt. So, good morning for some of you. Good afternoon from Portugal, where I am currently. I'm working on an interesting project here, and I'm also delivering hands-on training for a team of project managers. My name is Gilberto Costa, and I've been working with predictive projects and adaptive projects since 2003. And from my experience, to manage successful projects, we need to deal with project uncertainty. That's to say, we need to deal with project risks. You will have these slides after this presentation, so you have time to read more about me. So I would just skip these slides and move on. Today's project's complexity brings great challenge to our clients, to any type of organization. It's imperative to find ways on how to deal with project uncertainty. And I assume most of you are project managers. And as we know, uncertainty can affect our project objectives. And during this webinar, I'm going to present to you a simple and effective approach to deal with uncertainty that matters. In one word, risk. This is our agenda for today. We'll be talking about risk definition just to establish the basis and moving on until the project budget. I'm starting with a quote from Arthur Rudolph. He's a German scientist. He was a rocket engineer who played a key role in the development of a rocket called V2 during the Second World War. In fact, project manager is all about making decisions regarding the future with the information you have at the present time. It's not about managing the past or the present. It's about making a decision about the future. So what is it that distinguishes the thousands of years of history, of human history, from what we call modern times? Many of you have your own answer, but I think that the answer goes beyond the progress of science, technology, capitalism, and democracy. What defines the boundary between past and modern time is the notion that the future is more than a whim of the gods, and that we, men and women, are not passive before nature. The boundary between past and modern time is the mastery of risk. Project is uncertain as we look to the future, and risk is all what matters when we think about project. A bit about the history of risk management. The breakpoint that happened during the Renaissance period and after the introduction of the Arabic numerals in Europe. we know that all the tools, and you must know that all the tools we use today in risk management and in the analysis of decision and choice stem from the developments that took place between 1654 and 1760, with only a couple of exceptions. In 1875, Francis Galton, an Englishman, discovered the regression to the mean, and in 1952, Harry Markowitz developed the modern portfolio theory, or MPT, and by that developing that theory, he demonstrated mathematically why putting all your eggs in one basket is an unacceptable risk strategy. So as seen in this timeline, risk management is relatively new where compared to the history of human being. This is something that we must take in consideration when we're talking about risk and projects. So risk, let's talk about risk. If you ask someone to define risk, it's likely that they will come up with something similar to the first two lines in the slides. A situation involving exposure to danger or the possibility of something bad happening. That's what the dictionary says. And that's because we have grown up understand risk as a situation involving exposure to danger. For example, people say, I risked my life to save my dog, or do not use the stove inside a tent because of the risk of fire. So it's expected that people in general will think of risk as a threat. However, the ISO 31000 defines risk as effect of uncertainty on objectives. And that's quite important. And the PMBOK, the Project Management Board of Knowledge, goes even further, stating that the risk can also have a positive impact in our project objectives. So everybody have objectives, you have objectives, and companies have objectives too. And to achieve their objectives, they buy, they sell, and they invest in projects. Therefore, no matter what type of a project you are working on, it has an objective. And the risks can affect your project, my project. And specifically, risks can affect project objectives, such as project scope, project schedule, and project costs. But the effect that a risk has or may have on your project objectives can also be positive. So to establish risk can affect our project objectives, and the effect can be positive or negative. So if you are taking notes, write down that a risk isn't always negative. It can also be positive. I mean, it can be an opportunity. So what's important here is to highlight these two words, uncertainty and objectives. That's why you have to have a solid project objective description in your project charter. If you don't have this solid description, you will fail to manage your project and to deal with risk. Because if you don't know what your project objectives are, you will not be able to manage those risks or project risks well. But when we talk about risk, we think about uncertainty, because we said that uncertainty can affect our project objectives. So, as I said, you need to have a solid project objectives description. But moreover, You can't manage risks if you haven't identified it. You know, uncertainty is ubiquitous and risks are everywhere. At this very moment, right now, you might be wondering about things that might happen in the next couple of days, weeks, years. Let's say things that can happen in the near future, whatever near future means for you. So we know that risks come from uncertainty, but let's make it clear. Not all uncertainty are risks. And why? Well, because only uncertainty that affects objectives is what matters. When I'm teaching on risk management and helping people to identify risks in projects, they say, Gilberto, how much, how many risks should I identify, should I list? Because I don't have time to identify risks as I wish. I say, well, first you need to think about uncertainty that matters. If someone asks us, is it going to rain tomorrow in Canutama? Canutama is a small village in the north of Brazil, in the rainforest. Well, is it going to rain tomorrow in Canutama? I don't know, you don't know, and we don't care. But if I ask you, will your supplier deliver the hardware and install the software platform before your project deadline, at the end of October? Again, I don't know, but you ought to know. You ought to know it because you are supposed to care about your project. So if I ask you about your project, about uncertainty in your project, you ought to know because it matters for you. In this example, the uncertainty doesn't affect my objective, Gilberto's objective, but it will affect yours because we're talking about a delivery within your project. All in all, if it is uncertain and if it matters, then it's a risk. The essence of risk identification in project is to ask ourselves this question, and you can write down now. The question is, what is it that matters to the project stakeholders? And by answering these questions, we will be able to properly identify risks. But talking about uncertainty and risks, we need to understand that as the future is full of uncertainty, there are more than one type of uncertainty. So as previously said, uncertainty is ubiquitous, and more important is to know that not all uncertainty are the same. That's to say, there are more than one type of uncertainty we need to be aware of. First one is stochastic uncertainty. Stochastic uncertainty has one out of two possibilities. For example, will John, let's suppose a member of your project team, quit before the end of this project? Yes or no? Will the hardware, for example, the server machine, arrive on time? Yes or no? This is the type of uncertainty we call stochastic. Yes or no? We know that the effect of having a delivery on time or have a delayed delivery will be different. So it's one of two. Another type of uncertainty comes from the Greek aleia, which means dice, aleatoric. So aleatoric uncertainty is uncertainty that comes from a random process, like throwing a dice and predicting the result. In other words, the uncertainty we are observing is random. It's part of the natural process. And this type of uncertainty has one out of many possibilities. One out of many possible outcomes. For example, here I will not only ask about if it is be delivered on time or not. I will ask like how many days will the shipment be delayed. It can be 1, 2, or 3 or more days, even weeks. And the impact of having a delay of 1 day, 2 or 3 days will be different. Will be different in each of those scenarios. And the third one will be epistemic uncertainty. Epistemic uncertainty is that that type of uncertainty that comes from the lack of knowledge. In other words, we are not sure we know it, or we don't have enough information about it. And these are things that aren't clear yet. So it's possible to face a situation where we are not able to identify a risk or uncertainty just because we don't have enough information. And here is where the project manager play a key role by searching and looking for information with the client, with the supplier, within the team. So we need to not be passive and wait for someone to call us, but we will search for information to avoid or to this kind of uncertainty. Epistemic uncertainty is basically lack of knowledge. And the fact that I don't know about something doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. So common sources of epistemic uncertainty are, for example, inadequate understanding of the underlying process, imprecise evaluation of the related characteristics, for example. Another common source of epistemic uncertainty is incomplete or absence of a project documentation. I know project documentation sometimes is painful for some of us. But the point here is for you to seek for information within the project as much as possible. Not employing, of course, not employing disappropriate effort. So it is important to work and to use the appropriate approach. And finally, ontological uncertainty. This kind of uncertainties are things that we can't conceive. I'd say we cannot think of it. I usually play a trick with my team and say, think about something you can't conceive. They say, well, I can't. And that's right. And therefore, these are risks that will be tackled with workarounds because we can't predict that. And if we will deal with those risks using workarounds, we'll be able to use the management reserve, obviously. So this ontological uncertainty, for those risks, you have excuse to go to your sponsor and say, listen, something happened, it was unconceivable, and I need to use the management reserve, if you have a management reserve, of course. Well, moving on, when we think about risk, of course, that I have been dealing with risks in project and managing people, different type of project managers. But one reason that I think that one reason why some people have difficulty to understand risks is because they don't understand well the risk characteristics. So in order to help people to understand risk, I usually take, for example, two different games, and they are playing dice and playing Russian roulette. Why? Because we play Russian roulette with a 6-chamber revolver. Well, I don't play that. If you are going to play, that's the rule. That's the guideline. So getting a result in those games have a probability, the probability is 1 out of 6. We all know it. But even though they have the same probability, the impact of those risks are totally different. So project managers need to take into consideration not only the probability of a risk, but also its impact. let's take this funny example here. I have two team members, for example, Mary and John, and just for you to understand this in a very simple way, and this is just, we are just establishing the basis here. Let's imagine you have two very good, very good Java developer, Mary and John, in your XP extreme programming team doing pair programming. And for those who are used to agile methodology, using developing software with XP, you put two programmers side by side. So both are very good, and you can't afford one of them to submit a sick leave application during your project. So let's assume that no matter who takes a sick leave, the impact will be the same. That's to say, it would affect your project objectives on the same way. And let's assume they have different habits regarding food and board exercise. So it's, in this case, that will, I'd say, that will make, what will make the difference is that between Mary and John is, of course, not the impact, but the likelihood. So we assume that one of them is more likely to have healthy issues. And when we are identifying risk, it's not only about our suppliers and about things that might happen outside the project, impact our project, but we need to also identify risks within the project. And sometimes we neglect it. So if this is uncertainty, and if it could happen during the life of our project, we need to consider it as a project risk. So the question is, only impact matters? No, because in both cases, Mary and John, the impact will be the same. Now, as previously we talked about probability and impact, now again, but now we need to consider not only the impact, but also the probabilities. Well, and talking about probabilities, I don't intend to teach on maths, of course, but talking about probability, we know the way of how to calculate probability. So I assume you know how to work with calculated probability, because there are two types of probability in projects. Calculated probabilities are possible where all outcomes are known and the event is fair, of course. For example, using a non-tempered dice or loaded dice, crooked dice, it won't be fair. So when all possible outcomes are known and the event is fair, or in another case, when there is a specific formula to calculate the result. But there is another type of probability which is called theoretical probability or speculative. And it occurs where not all outcomes are known, no formula is available to calculate the probability, and when the assessment of probability is subjective. And now I would like you to think and ask, about this question. What type of probability you, as a project manager, think is common in your projects? The reason I'm asking this is because we tend to misunderstand and confuse calculated probability with theoretical probability. For example, when we have a history of a supplier delivering goods for us for the last month or for the last year, for example, we look to the data, calculate the probabilities and say, well, this supplier have been delivering good way, 10% probability of delivery on time, this one 20%, this one 5%, and with tend to think that this is absolute, this is calculated. Well, that number should be just a guide, because it's not exact, it's not absolute that the next delivery will be on time. So we speculate, we use data and we use calculated probability, but in project we will speculate about the probabilities. So I think this is quite important to understand when we are talking about how to deal with risk. Moving on, why risk management? Well, first, because risk management is something that works. I have worked with companies that have a risk management methodology in place, and not only one, but some of them have been developing and enhancing their risk management methodology. I'm quite happy with them, but they still fail to implement risk management effectively in the project. They have a risk management methodology at the corporate level. They implement risk management and operations, but when it comes to project, it becomes a bit harder. And I believe that management activities such as investing in feasibility study, assessing potential partners, and having, I would say, committees or risk officers providing adequate information to company board are of good value, not, of course. But I think that in order to get the most benefit from risk management, organization must have a methodology embedded in their project activities. So easy to embed the risk management methodology in the project activities, because many project managers complain about not having enough time to deal with the present, so they don't want to think about the future because they are too busy. But fact is that the risk management is the key driver for the project success, not only at the corporate level but at the project level. So that's why I'm going to now to talk about something that I think it's important, which is psychology of risk. And we know that statistic information it's helpful, but it will influence the decision. But risk management is mainly to help decision makers. I mean, we look to the future, we look to the possible uncertainty that matters, we identify that, and that is what we use to make good decisions. And project managers need to make good decisions on daily basis, not only monthly or bi-week, but on daily basis. We need to look to the future. We need to look to those possible uncertainty. Anyway, despite having nice tools and process in place, because I think that most of we consultants working with different companies will be in a place where some companies have good tools and process. But despite having nice tools and process in places, our decisions are always influenced by psychological factors. You probably know the story of the G.I. Joe inventor. I'll not present this, but I will. I assume you know this story. The guy who invented the G.I. Joe and took it to Hasbro, and Hasbro made him an offer, a fantastic offer, and that was having $70,000 in cash at the moment, or signing a contract to have royalties for his entire life. Well, he took the first option. Well, the decision of stakeholder will be based on the current situation, based also on the wealth of individual, because if you can afford, you will make a decision differently. That's a situation where you can't afford. But anyway, your previous experience also will influence, and your attitude towards risk. Here is where I think project managers have to deal with the risk in project, because we mainly deal with stakeholders, and stakeholders are people, and rational decisions are not possible always. Rational decisions roles are those that say deciding according with the most advantageous expected value. That's what rationale says. In other words, decide in favor of maximal advantage, usually money, that statistically is statistically predicted. But the theory, this prospect theory, says that for a certain common conditions or combination of choice, there will be violation of rational decision rules. Prospect theory, for example, states that you or your stakeholder will make decision, will take a risk that has a potential loss coupled with a possible gain, rather than suffer a sure loss. For example, when you are facing a delay in your project with penalties, it's high likely that if you bring this situation to your stakeholder, to your client, and present, listen, that was the budget. We just have left it on our reserve, let's say 10,000 euros, but it won't be enough to deliver it on time, this key deliverable, this main deliverable, and that means that we will suffer a penalty. And the penalty, let's say, we're $5 million or 5 million euros. So how much would you invest to avoid that sure loss? What project managers need to think when dealing with the stakeholders. And talking about stakeholders, we need also to think that stakeholders usually in project don't have time, many stakeholders don't have time to identify and to analyze risks. This is my work as a project manager. That is my duty, your duty as a project manager. So, and I think that it's quite clear that probability and impact influences our risk assessment, and I have this animation here to show, for example, when an air crash occurs, some people start to fear flying because they think that the likelihood of another air crash has increased. So let's say air crash impact very high, probability very low, but because of the previous and very recent accident, air crash, it leads people to think it won't end, but to think as high likely, in fact is more secure, but they think that high likely, and they assess the risk in the wrong way. So we think that it has a high exposure, but it hasn't. Anyway, project stakeholder, that's the key for project. We deal with people in project. And speaking of people, one of the great source of risk in projects are people, because projects are done by people, to people, and with people. So what are we missing? We are failing to properly identify our project stakeholders. So just to establish this breakpoint here. Until now, we've been talking about risk and how people look to risk and react to risk and identify risks and respond. And I want to bring this subject here to this presentation because we often neglected stakeholders in the risk management. And risk is about uncertainty, and there's no other factor in project beyond, I would say, the risk of dealing with people. So dealing with risk in project is to deal with people. But we know that all the approach to project management have a process to identify stakeholders. But there is a misconception of what identify stakeholders means. And I want to talk about this, how to identify stakeholders properly. Most of the project success or failure factors are connected to people. We know that. Let's say, in order to get a user involvement in the project manager, in the project, let's say, the project and his team need to know that stakeholder must be invited to contribute with the key insight regarding, for example, product usability. We need to talk with customers, with the end user. For example, someone from the users group and another person from the suppliers group, and people from the end user group need to provide the user perspective before we actually design a product. There is also a need to identify who from the executive group, for example, not only the sponsor, but the sponsor is already identified, but some functional manager, someone in the senior management that are interested in our project and can affect our project effectively, because the definition of stakeholder is people or organization that can impact our project or be impacted by our project. So project stakeholders is something that we really need to consider when we think about project risk. Again, because people is what is the key for success for a project. But some project managers, I'd say that they misunderstand the process of identifying people in project. Most of the project managers I know are happy with the idea of simply having the stakeholders contact information in their phone book so they can, I would say, quickly call them when they need. But that's a wrong. Actually, some project managers sometimes use the contact list to filter or to block incoming calls. Anyway, yeah, moving here. I'll put here, okay. Good. When do you identify your stakeholders? It's important to, after the identify stakeholder, of course, analyze them. But we don't identify stakeholders to simply know who they are. The reason we record the stakeholders' information is to know what we can do with them. So if you think that having a spreadsheet or even a centralized record of all project stakeholders with the information belonging to the stakeholders is sufficient. If you think that is sufficient, I tell you it's not. Project managers need to study and record stakeholders' profile with a relevant information, not only individuals' information, but also related information. And as a professional in the project management area, you know well this matrix. I think you are used to this, which shows the power and the interest of stakeholders. And generally speaking, the project manager rarely can change the power, the power level of the stakeholders. So it's important to, when identify stakeholders, try to see to make sure you know their expectations. And we don't have the ability to influence the power of them, but despite not ability, change the part of the stakeholder. I think, and I guess you agree with me, I think that for the sake of our project, the project manager must work out the level of interest of some stakeholders. That's to say, we need to work, need to be proactive, try to raise their level of interest. In other words, while managing stakeholders, you aim to move them to the right side of this matrix. And once you identify the stakeholders, I would say that don't stop with the data about the stakeholders simply. I mean, be aware of the connections among the project stakeholders. I know that we need to be, I'd say, to be cautious and preserve some level of privacy. But sometimes information that seems to be irrelevant to the project you are working with becomes of great importance within the sphere of risk management. I'll tell you, I share experience. I remember a few years ago, while I was I was in charge of managing a project for baggage handling system in the South America, Brazil. I was working in an international airport, and one of the internal stakeholders issued a change request. He demanded a change request, which was favorable for us as suppliers. And we get approval from the client. So far, so good. And we moved to redesign the conveyor belt. That was fantastic. But a few days later, my boss called me and told me that the requested change document wasn't valid because the kind of change would require a contract change. However, the client's architect who approved it did not have authority to change the contract, and consequently, we, my company, we would need to get a valid formal approval. But the problem was that we had already made the change, the physical change. And to make a long story short, I'll tell you that the requested change document should be signed by the stakeholder who had signed the contract, the same person. And I was then running against the clock to avoid the rework. The man was a very busy man in this world. It was really hard to schedule an appointment with him. However, because someone in my team had documented the stakeholders as I usually do, we had information that one person, one minor stakeholder, happened to be directly connected to that key stakeholders, and we use that lower stakeholder to access the other one. So it is important to use intelligence, and not gossipy. Actually, that's less important stakeholder, let's say, happen to be the wife of the most important stakeholders, and we have that information there. The way I do this is simply by having a information like this. I have here, for example, use this. For example, I have the names of the stakeholder here. I have the level of influence and interest here, which give me a result. I have some strategic approach here, and I also record pertinent relationship with other stakeholders. For example, here I have this Danny Glover stakeholder. He is connected to Thomas Black, this other stakeholder, with they have different rates in my analysis. But I also have information comments which could be helpful for my project. So this is how we deal with projects. We need to be aware of the stakeholders within our project. And another way that we deal with project risks is by anticipate future change. For example, let's see, by documenting project relationship, activity relationship. For example, I know that another source of risk is coming from the lack of information. We talk about this, lack of information regarding project schedule, for example. And if we don't have good information in the future, people will make changes without considering the reality of a project. So it's important to see this as a necessity. It's really need to have good documentation, so we can, in the future, we can avoid changes that are, I would say, for example, we can't, if we want to decide to make a fast track, we can't make fast track with mandatory dependency, for example. If it's not well documented, it will be result in rework. When we are estimating our project, it's actually another source of risk, because if we don't estimate well, we won't be able to manage well. So let's say we usually estimate projects like this. We have the activity cost for each activity, we sum up, we have a contingency, we call padding sometimes, but we are not considering risks of this project. So it's important to avoid padding estimates, guesses, some amount of money to deal with uncertainty that is not properly identified. We actually, what we actually need to do is we need to identify those risks that are unacceptable, put all those risks in activities like this here to respond to those risks, include these on the project estimates. We need to calculate contingency for those unacceptable risks, and this will compose my baseline, which is of the accountability for the project manager. Take this, okay. So this is what we call unacceptable risks, and this is what we call contingency reserve for those risks that, of course, are recorded in the risk register. For those risks that we can't conceive uncertainty, we call ontological uncertainty, that will be dealt with the management reserve. Another key is we are running out of time, but is I think it's another source of problems is risk identification. We usually identify risk like, not we, but when people don't know how to identify risk, they have a generic statement like, there is a risk of overspending this project, or there is a risk of failing the final deliverable. I would say we'll change that and put something that includes the root cause, the risk of the area of risk, and the impact, for example. Here we say the high winds is the cause. Roof of the barn will blow off, which is the event, and the consequence, loss of livestock. All in all, when we identify a risk, we need to make proper assessment, and that is calculate the impact and the probability and getting the risk exposure. That is what will help us to determine what kind of response we're going to use. For example, avoid, it means that we have, if we have identified the risk, to avoid this we need to change our plan. We need to change our plan, or you can mitigate, or you can transfer these risks, or you can just accept those risks and have a contingency to deal with those risks. Mainly, and to summarize this, say risk is uncertainty that affect our project objectives. but not all uncertainty will affect it. Use intelligence to manage stakeholders. Document activities dependencies is another advice I'll give to you. Document activities dependencies. Sometimes just put one activity after other without documenting the dependencies. And assume that subjective probability is the most common type of probability in projects. Be aware of the factors that can influence risk assessment, for example, utility, and create a contingency reserve based on the identified risks. And finally, create a contingency plan consistent with your project profile. That's all. If you have any question.
Thank you, Gilberto. We have a question. Let me just verbally ask that. Okay. The first one is, how do we attend to and manage people risks in projects, especially considering the fact the project managers can withhold information about the project and maintain an optimistic view when they know the project is failing?
If I understood well, the second part said that considering that the project manager can't hold or can hold information.
Can withhold information about the project.
Okay. How to deal with people? Well, what I do, I think that the key is first you need to consider to identify which layer these people belongs to, because we have basically 3 layers. We have the management layer where we are project managers, and we have the team delivery team below us, with team leaders and other team members, and we have at the corporate level we have the executive level. The way I think that we can deal with people and consider the information is first is consider the information we must have, because in most cases we don't have enough information, and from my experience, project managers don't search for information, they just work with the information that are provided to, and sometimes we are quite negligent, I would say, because I was like that, negligent to search for new information, to talk to people, to be involved with people, and to look and to go for it. We don't wait for information to come to us. To deal with people, we need to go to people. I mean, going to coffee with people, having time with them, doing networking with them, things like we think that we don't have time to, because we need to execute a project. My advice is to think more about being with people than that will be my first advice, being with people instead of waiting for information.
Okay, thank you. We will take one more question because we don't have more time. Is there a possibility to have access to management reserve without authorization?
No, not at all. The idea of management reserve is a reserve that the organization established or calculated based on the level of confidence. Of course, on other factors, for example, their appetite to risk. But let's say that we have this new project in a new country, and our project manager are very experienced, but it's a new project, new technology, and a new country. So it's quite uncertain. So we, as corporate, we decide to have an amount of money, let's say, which we call management reserve, in case something unpredictable happens. And the only excuse, I would say, or the only reason for a project manager to request the management reserve is when a risk belongs to an ontological uncertainty. I mean, it's unpredictable, because the key is when a project manager, go to my sponsor and ask for management reserve or for helping, the sponsor should ask, is this risk unpredictable? Was it unpredictable, or you did not predict it? You did not identify it, because it took different things. So the only excuse to use management reserve is, in ideal world, is for the unpredictable or unknown risks.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, Gilberto. And thank you for the highly informative webinar, and thank you to the participants who have taken time off their busy schedules to participate in this webinar. I'm sure that everyone has learned something new today. So this webinar is recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to check back on our upcoming webinars on topics of your interest by visiting our website or social media pages. Meet you all again same day, same time next week. Thank you, Gilberto. If you would like to conclude with something.
Well, I just want to reinforce the idea that we really need to have information, and we need to be proactive to get information and to provide very clear and complete information, not only for us to make our decision as a project manager, but to help our sponsor and our management to help them to make good decisions. And the key is information, current information, to make a decision about the future.
Thank you very much. I would also like to note out that the presentation will also be found on our SlideShare, so if you would like to refer back to it, and also our YouTube channel, as I said before. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.